Catholic University professor Andrew Yo, what is the thesis of your book, Activists, Alliances, and Anti-U.S. Based Protests?
Right, well, so the United States has about 700 bases around the world, at least reported by the Pentagon. And there's, in the last 10, 20 years, we've seen more and more anti-base protests, opposition to U.S. military presence abroad. And so I'm looking at really two questions. One is, with all this anti-base activism, when do they make a difference? When do they actually affect basing policy? And then the second question is really about host governments, our allies. On one hand, they face pressure from civil society at the domestic level, but they also face pressure from the United States to maintain alliance obligations. So I want to know how these host governments balance between these two forces at the domestic and the international level.
When you look at these 700 plus bases around the world that the U.S. has, how many of them are welcomed in these foreign lands?
The majority of them, I would say, are actually welcome. So it's, you're looking at, if there's 700 bases, they're probably more. It's just, they just can't be declared, or they're secret bases. I'd say, it's hard to say whether they're welcome, but the host governments accept them. But I'd say at least 75%, they're not contested, so to say. The majority of bases are in places like Germany or in mainland Japan. But the few that have been contested seem to cause lots of problems for U.S. diplomats, for the U.S. military here, because we see those bases as critical.
Such as where?
So Okinawa has been, there's been this long-running feud in Okinawa where the Okinawans have been upset about a specific base. In 1995, there was a horrible rape case where a schoolgirl was gang raped, and the Okinawans demanded justice, but under the Status of Forces Agreement, they were placed under the custody of the American military. So as part of the deal, because this was going to really mess up U.S.-Japan alliance relations, the U.S. agreed to relocate that base from, the name of the base is Futenma Air Station. It's in the news even today. So they said that they would relocate it to the northern part of Okinawa if the Okinawans built a replacement facility. Well, that base still exists, and they haven't been able to move forward because there's been so much opposition from Okinawans about creating a new base. And if you look at this base, it sits smack in the middle of a city. Schools have to stop for about 10 minutes, 3 times, 4 times a day, because, or in the past they had to, because of aircraft, because of helicopters coming in, and because of things like environmental concern, noise pollution, crime around bases. There has been this opposition. So Okinawa is one place where we've seen such opposition. The Philippines, of course, in the 1990s, we had 2 major bases there: Subic Naval Base, and then Clark Air Base.
And when you say major, we're talking hundreds of
about
thousands.
When it closed, there was about 14,000 troops.
And hundreds of thousands of people depended on that base, correct?
Right, and not only for security, but the local economy. There's a domestic economy for bases, and of course, because of opposition from activists, from nationalist politicians, eventually they gave the Americans the boot. So we had to withdraw, not just from those 2 major bases, but all U.S. military had to withdraw by the end of 1992.
Professor Yo, do you think that we'd still have those bases if the volcano hadn't exploded?
Right, so I think they would have maintained for at least another 7 to 10 years for certain, and who knows if the strategic environment would have persisted. I know there was a lot of damage because of Mount Pinatubo exploding at the time, and they had rendered, I think, Clark Air Base almost unusable. But at least for Subic Naval Station, it was the largest base in the Pacific outside of Hawaii, and the U.S. military expressed, if you listen to congressional testimony, they did want to maintain that base for at least another 7 to 10 years. So it would have, I believe that it would have, the base would have continued to exist.
What are some of the geopolitical ramifications of the closing of that major Philippine military installation?
Right. So of course this is the Pacific Command, so PACOM. Many of, in terms of the functions, they were dispersed to Okinawa. Some went back to Hawaii. And in the long run, the U.S. military is adaptable, and policymakers are adaptable, so they were able to make do. But these days, just given the strategic climate right now, with China's growing maritime assertiveness, with uncertainties and tensions with these islands between Japan, South Korea, China, and Southeast Asian countries, some are wishing that the U.S. actually return to the Philippines. And so right now we've worked out this deal where we come on a rotating basis, and there's been rumors that the Philippine government may want the U.S. to come back. My personal take is that we probably won't have permanent forces there. We won't have a large military presence again like we did in the past, but when we say rotating forces or visiting forces, they come in and out, so it's almost like de facto having a continuous U.S. presence, military presence in the Philippines.
Where else have there been protests against the U.S. presence?
So in Europe, I mean, there are always pockets of protest whenever tragedies happen. In Italy, there was a gondola that was sliced by, I think it was an F-15, and then leading to the tragic deaths of several skiers. And so you had opposition, you had protests related to those specific incidents. But where you've seen larger protests, where it's not just a not in my backyard, a NIMBY type protest, but something that galvanizes, I think, much of the country, or at least you see anti-base opposition at a national level. I mean, we've seen this in Italy. There was the expansion of an air base in northern Italy, in Vicenza, and there'd been protests from 2006, 2007, and it's died down a lot, but they're still ongoing. We've seen protests in Ecuador, which is highlighted in my book, Manta Air Base, which eventually closed down as well. And then of course the big places in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now it's hard to say whether it's activists or is it civil society that's opposed to it, because you have insurgents that obviously Islamic extremists who don't like U.S. who don't want the U.S. military to be on their soil, but in terms of the government as well too, we've seen opposition from politicians, and as we've seen, we didn't leave that large presence in place in Iraq that many assumed that we would, because the government had opposed to it. And in Afghanistan, it's still up in the air what's going to happen at the end of 2014. So we do see opposition to U.S. bases, and not just in Asia, where my book tends to focus a bit more on Asia, but we see this in really all corners of the world.
Are there locations in the world where even the government would like us to leave?
Meaning national governments. In the past, yes. So a lot of times when you see regimes change, when you see what we saw in Libya or in Iran after the revolution, of course, U.S. forces had to leave. Today, do we see government opposition? It's not as direct. In the Ecuador case, this was in 2000. This was in 2007, 2008. U.S. bases became a major issue, issue in just Ecuadorian politics, and there you do see certain elements of the government wanting U.S. bases to leave, and they're able to play up the nationalist card. They talk a lot about national sovereignty, and from the standpoint of domestic governments, I mean, you might understand. There's no other really. I mean, if I were to flip the question around, if the Chinese or if the Russians had a base here in the United States, and something happens, such as an accident or crime, there'd be a large outcry. We see this because we have U.S. bases on it. There's domestic bases everywhere, or we don't call them domestic bases, just military bases all around. And of course, there could be even opposition to bases in our own country from Americans, but it takes it's a whole nother level when you have a foreign base on your own soil. And so in certain periods of time, you've seen governments not wanting U.S. bases in their country. So today, Japan, so I mentioned Japan and Okinawa. In 2009, you had